Lydia was just going through the motions of another late-night shift at the diner when a quiet little girl, barely touching her food, slipped a crumpled napkin into her hand. 4 desperate words were scrawled across it. "Help me. He is not my dad." By the time Lydia looked up, they were gone. Now, with nothing but a gut feeling and a name from a receipt, she must unravel the truth before it's too late. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and please like the video to show support. Now get comfortable and let the story unfold. The diner was nearly empty, save for the regulars who lingered over their coffee and late-night meals. The neon sign outside buzzed softly, flickering between shades of pink and blue, casting a dull glow over the rain-slicked pavement. Lydia wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that night, her mind drifting between thoughts of overdue bills and the aching exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. It had been a long shift, and she still had hours to go before she could drag herself home. The bell above the door jingled, cutting through the soft hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes. Lydia glanced up, offering a reflexive smile as a man and a little girl stepped inside. They were an unusual pair, not just because of the late hour, but because something about them felt off. The man looked ordinary enough, dressed in a dark sweater and jeans, his hair neatly combed back. He carried himself with a certain ease, but there was a stiffness in his posture, a slight tension around his jaw that Lydia's practiced eye caught immediately. The girl, however, was what held Lydia's attention. She was small, maybe 7 or 8, with dark curls that framed her pale face. She clutched the sleeves of her coat with tiny fists, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself disappear. Her eyes darted around the diner, landing briefly on Lydia before quickly shifting away. There was something hesitant, almost fearful, in the way she moved, like she didn't belong there, like she was waiting for something to happen. Lydia stepped out from behind the counter, grabbing 2 menus as she made her way to them. "Evening," she said with a warm smile. "Just the 2 of you tonight?" The man nodded, his lips curving slightly in what could have been mistaken for politeness. "Yes, thank you." His voice was smooth, steady, but Lydia noticed how his hand rested firmly on the girl's shoulder, fingers pressing just a little too tightly. The girl flinched, not enough to be obvious, but enough for Lydia to notice. She felt a flicker of unease but pushed it aside. She had seen all kinds of family dynamics over the years. Maybe the girl was just shy, maybe she wasn't feeling well. There were 100 logical explanations. She led them to a booth near the window, placing the menus in front of them. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" The man barely glanced at the menu. "Coffee. Black." Lydia turned to the girl who was staring down at her hands. "And for you, sweetheart?" the man answered for her. "She'll have water." Lydia hesitated, waiting to see if the girl would speak for herself. She didn't. Her small fingers picked at the hem of her coat, her shoulders rising slightly as if she were bracing for something. "I'll be right back with those," Lydia said, keeping her voice light as she turned toward the counter. As she filled the man's coffee cup and poured the water, she kept an eye on the booth. The man spoke in low tones, leaning slightly toward the girl, who nodded stiffly in response. She wasn't eating. She wasn't even touching the menu. Lydia frowned. Balancing the drinks on a tray, she made her way back over. "Here we go. Have. You had a chance to decide." The man ordered quickly, eggs, bacon, toast. The girl said nothing. "She'll have the same," he said before Lydia could ask. Another small thing. Another red flag. Lydia jotted it down, forcing her smile to stay in place. "Coming right up." She turned away, but she wasn't finished watching them. Years of working in the diner had given her a sharp instinct when something wasn't right. She had dealt with rowdy customers, cheating spouses and families unraveling right in front of her. But this was different. There was no outburst, no obvious aggression, just a quiet wrongness that set her nerves on edge. At the counter, she leaned against the register, watching in the reflection of the coffee pot's polished surface. The man ate steadily, speaking every so often, while the girl barely touched her food. Occasionally he would gesture with his fork, his movements deliberate, controlled. Then, something happened that made Lydia's breath hitch. The girl lifted her eyes and looked straight at her. It was only for a second, maybe two, but in that brief moment, Lydia saw something that made her stomach drop. Fear. Not the shy kind, not the nervousness of a child overwhelmed by strangers, but real, deep-seated fear. Lydia's grip tightened on the counter. The girl quickly looked away, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. Something was wrong. Lydia didn't know what, but she felt it in her gut. She took their plates to the back, barely registering. When the cook muttered something about the late hour, her mind was spinning. What should she do? What could she do? Call the police? And tell them what? That a girl was scared? That a man seemed off? They wouldn't take it seriously. She needed more than just a feeling. By the time she returned to the dining area, the man was reaching for his wallet. "Can I get you anything else?" Lydia asked, hoping to stretch the moment, to find something, anything out of place. "No. We're all set," he said smoothly, placing a few bills on the table. "Keep the change." Lydia hesitated, her eyes flickering to the girl, who was already sliding out of the booth. There was nothing more she could do. She forced herself to step back. The girl reached for her coat, her movements quick and small. As she pulled it on, her eyes flickered to Lydia once more. And then, so quickly Lydia almost missed it, her tiny hand reached out and slipped something onto the table, a napkin. Crumpled. Lydia barely had time to register it before the man placed a firm hand on the girl's back, steering her toward the door. The bell jingled as they stepped outside. Lydia stood frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. Only when they disappeared into the night did she move. Slowly, she reached for the napkin, her fingers trembling as she unfolded it. 4 words. 4 small, uneven words written in shaky, childish handwriting. "Help me. He is not my dad." Lydia's breath caught. The tray in her hand slipped from her grip, shattering. As it hit the floor, Lydia stared at the crumpled napkin in her trembling hands, the words burning into her mind like a brand. The diner around her blurred, the sounds of clinking plates and quiet conversation fading into a distant hum. The tray she had been holding lay shattered at her feet, shards of ceramic glinting under the fluorescent lights. But she couldn't move. She couldn't think. Her pulse pounded against her skull, her breath shallow and uneven. "Help me. He is not my dad." She looked up toward the door, half expecting to see them still there, the little girl looking back at her with those pleading eyes. But the diner's entrance was empty, the glass door reflecting nothing but the neon glow of the sign outside. They were gone, the weight of the moment pressed against her chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an overactive imagination, twisting something innocent into something sinister. The girl had reached out to her. She had asked for help, and Lydia had let her walk out that door. A sharp voice snapped her back to reality. "Lydia, you okay?" Her co-worker, Clara, had rushed over, eyes flickering between her face and the mess on the floor. Lydia barely registered her presence. Her hands clenched around the napkin, her fingers curling into the fabric as if she could will the words away, as if she could unsee them. Clara knelt, beginning to pick up the broken pieces of the plate. What happened? Lydia forced herself to speak, though her voice came out strangled. "That man, the one with the little girl, did you see which way they went?" Clara frowned, glancing toward the window. "I don't know, they left pretty fast." She paused. "Lids, what's going on?" Lydia's throat was dry, her heart still hammering. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. If she wasted any more time, they would be out of reach, swallowed by the dark streets and endless possibilities of where they could go. She turned abruptly, bolting toward the door, ignoring Clara's startled call behind her. Outside, the cold air hit her like a slap. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few old cars lined up under flickering streetlights. Her gaze darted in every direction, desperate to catch sight of them. Nothing. She stepped farther out, her breath fogging in the night air, heart pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. A creeping panic clawed its way up her spine. They were gone. She cursed under her breath, spinning back toward the diner. Her mind raced through the possibilities. He could have turned onto any street, could be heading out of town already. A motel, a gas station, An interstate ramp. There were too many places, too many ways for him to disappear. She forced herself to think. Think. The man had paid with a credit card. A new surge of hope shot through her, and she sprinted back inside, her breath shallow as she pushed past Clara and rushed to the register. "I need the last receipt," she said, her voice urgent. Clara, who had been sweeping up the mess Lydia had abandoned, blinked at her. "What?" "The guy with the little girl," Lydia said, barely able to keep herself from shaking. "He paid with a card. We should have his name, maybe part of the number. I just need to see it." Clara hesitated, concern flickering across her face. "Lydia, you're kind of freaking me out." Lydia didn't care how she looked. She didn't care if Clara thought she was losing it. Every second that passed was another second the little girl was getting farther away. Clara sighed and moved to the register, punching in a few buttons before the small receipt printer whirred to life. She pulled out the paper and handed it over. Lydia's eyes scanned it, searching frantically. Marcus Talbot. The name meant nothing to her, but it was something. The first few digits of the credit card were blacked out, but the last 4 remained visible. She didn't know if that would be enough to track him down, but at least now she wasn't grasping at nothing. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers fumbling as she dialed. "Who are you calling?" Clara asked, her voice tinged with concern. "The police." Clara's eyes widened. "Lydia." She turned away, listening to the ringing in her ear, her pulse thudding as she waited. A woman's voice answered. 911, what's your emergency?" Lydia inhaled sharply. I think a little girl might be in danger." Silence for half a beat. Then, "Can you clarify the situation?" Lydia forced herself to focus, to speak clearly. "A man came into the diner with a little girl. She slipped me a note when she left. It said, 'Help me, he is not my dad.'" The operator's voice remained calm, professional. "Do you know the name of the man?" "Yes. Marcus Talbot. I have his last 4 card numbers. I think he might be taking her somewhere, but I don't know where. They left about 10 minutes ago." "Did you witness any immediate danger?" Lydia hesitated. "No, but she looked terrified. I could tell something was wrong." There was another pause. "Ma'am, we don't have any active Amber Alerts in your area. Without evidence of immediate harm or a missing person report, we can't intervene based on suspicion alone." Lydia's grip tightened on the phone. "Are you serious? She literally told me she was in danger. I understand your concern, but we need more to go on." Lydia's pulse pounded in frustration. They weren't going to help, they were going to let him walk away. "We can send a patrol car to check nearby areas," the operator offered. "Do you have a vehicle description?" Lydia racked her brain. She hadn't noticed the car, damn it. "No," she admitted, her voice shaking with anger. "We'll do what we can, ma'am, but unless there's more information—" Lydia barely heard the rest. She muttered a quick thanks before hanging up. Clara was staring at her wide-eyed. "They're not doing anything, are they?" Lydia exhaled sharply, her hands shaking as she rubbed her face. "No," Clara hesitated. "So what do we do?" Lydia looked down at the receipt, at the name that now felt burned into her mind. Her gut told her that little girl didn't have time for official channels, for paperwork and protocols. If the police wouldn't do anything, then she would. She met Clara's gaze, the determination settling like a stone in her chest. "I find her myself." Lydia didn't sleep. She couldn't. Not with that little girl's terrified eyes haunting her, not with the words from that crumpled napkin burned into her mind. The diner was long closed, the neon lights outside flickering against the empty parking lot, but she sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, her foot tapping anxiously against the floor. Every logical part of her brain told her to go home, to let the police handle it, to stop acting like she was some kind of detective. But then she thought about the way the girl had looked at her, the silent plea in her expression, the way she had barely touched her food, her hands twisting the fabric of her coat like she was trying to hold herself together. She started her car. If the police weren't going to act fast enough, she would. The first problem was that she had no idea where to look. She had the man's name, Marcus Talbot, and his last 4 credit card digits, but that wasn't enough to track him down in any official capacity. She needed to think like him, to figure out where a man traveling with a little girl would go this late at night. Motels, It was the only logical choice. Lydia pulled out of the parking lot, her fingers tightening on the steering wheel as she turned onto the main road. There were only a handful of places in town where someone could check in without too many questions, and she knew exactly where to start. The first place she stopped was a rundown roadside motel off the highway, the kind with flickering vacancy signs and peeling paint. She pulled into the lot, scanning the parked cars, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't even know what kind of car he drove. Stepping out of her car, she tried to keep her expression neutral as she walked toward the front desk. A tired-looking man with graying hair barely looked up from his newspaper. "Need a room?" he asked, not bothering to hide his boredom. Lydia shook her head. "Actually, I'm looking for someone. My brother. He was supposed to meet me here, but I think I got the wrong motel." The man sighed, clearly not in the mood for conversation. "You got a name?" She hesitated, then forced herself to say it. "Marcus Talbot." The man didn't react right away, but there was a flicker of recognition, just for a second. Lydia's stomach twisted. "I don't know, lady. I don't check IDs here," he muttered, flipping a page in his newspaper. "People pay, they get. Her key, that's how it works." She took a slow breath. "Was he alone?" The man's eyes flicked up to her then, his expression unreadable. "Look, I don't know anything about that. You should try somewhere else." Lydia's skin prickled. He knew something. She leaned in slightly. "Please, it's important." The man exhaled sharply, setting his paper down. "Listen, I don't want trouble, but if I were you, I'd check the Silver Creek Motel. It's a little off the main road, quieter. The kind of place people go when they don't want to be found." That was all she needed to hear. She was back in her car before he could change, his mind gripping the wheel so tight her knuckles ached. Silver Creek. She knew the place. It was barely lit, hidden between stretches of empty road and dense trees, a perfect place for someone who didn't want attention. She drove fast, too. Fast, but she couldn't bring herself to slow down. Every second counted. When she finally pulled into the motel's parking lot, her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The place was dark, only a few of the rooms showing signs of life. She scanned the parked cars, searching for anything that felt out of place, anything that looked rushed, temporary. Then she saw it, a dark sedan parked near the back, facing away from the road. Something about it made her gut tighten. Lydia turned off her engine, forcing herself to take a steadying breath. She couldn't just barge in. She needed to be smart. She needed to be careful. She stepped out of her car, keeping her movements slow, deliberate. The night air was cold, the silence stretching around her like a heavy weight. She walked toward the motel office, her mind racing with a plan. Inside, the woman behind the counter barely glanced at her. "Need a room?" Lydia shook her head. "Actually, I'm supposed to be meeting someone here, my niece. I think my brother checked in earlier, but my phone's dead and I can't reach him." "Marcus Talbot?" The woman frowned, her fingers tapping against the desk. "You said a kid's with him?" Lydia's pulse jumped. "Yeah, 7, dark hair, kind of quiet." The woman hesitated, then sighed. "Look, I'm not supposed to give out guest info, but..." She lowered her voice. "That guy was weird. The girl wouldn't even look up when I handed him the key, and when I said something to her, he answered for her." Lydia swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "What room?" The woman hesitated again, then exhaled. "Room 12. But be careful, okay?" Lydia nodded, her heart racing as she turned toward the row of doors. Room 12 was near the end, partially hidden in the shadows of the lot. The curtains were drawn, but a faint light seeped through the edges. She moved closer, keeping to the side, listening. A low voice. Not the girl's. "Marcus." She pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow. Then she heard it, a quiet sniffle. The girl was crying, Lydia's hands clenched into fists. She couldn't wait, she knocked hard. Silence. She knocked again. "Hey, sorry to bother you, but I think I parked in the wrong spot." Footsteps. The door cracked open just slightly, and Marcus's face appeared, his eyes narrowing. "What?" His voice was sharp, impatient. Lydia forced a nervous chuckle. She glanced past him, heart hammering. The girl was sitting on the bed, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the floor. Marcus shifted, blocking the view. "I don't know you." Lydia met his gaze, her stomach twisting. She had to think fast. "Sorry, my mistake," she said quickly, stepping back. She turned as if to leave, her hands shaking at her sides. Then, before he could close the door, she shouted, "Sweetheart, it's okay, I'm here." The girl's head snapped up. Marcus spun, rage twisting his features. "What the hell?" Lydia didn't wait. She lunged forward, slamming her weight against the door. Marcus stumbled back, caught off guard just enough for her to slip inside. The girl's eyes widened in shock. Lydia reached for her, her heart pounding. "Come on," she whispered. For a split second, the girl hesitated. Then she moved. She grabbed Lydia's hand, fingers icy with fear. Marcus recovered fast. "Get away from her!" Lydia yanked the girl behind her, her voice steady despite the terror racing through her. "I'm not leaving without her." Marcus's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. But before he could take another step, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Lydia barely had time to process the blaring sirens before Marcus lunged toward her. She yanked the little girl behind her, gripping her tiny hand with all the strength she had. Marcus's expression twisted into something primal, something unhinged. He was cornered and he knew it. Lydia braced herself, heart hammering. But before he could reach them, the wailing police cars skidded into the parking lot, tires screeching against the asphalt. Red and blue lights flashed through the grimy motel window, casting eerie streaks against the peeling wallpaper. A voice, loud and authoritative, boomed from outside. "Step away from the girl and put your hands in the air." Marcus froze. His breath was ragged, his fists twitching at his sides. Lydia tightened her grip on the child, pulse pounding so hard she thought she might pass out. The girl whimpered, shrinking behind her. A second later, the motel door burst open, the force of it slamming against the wall. 2 officers stormed in, guns drawn. "Get down on the ground," one of them shouted. Marcus's eyes darted between them, between Lydia and the girl, between the open window and the only possible escape. Roots. But it was too late. For a moment, Lydia thought he might run anyway. Then, with a sharp exhale, he slowly raised his hands. The next few minutes blurred together in a mess of movement and adrenaline. The officers took control, forcing Marcus to the ground, cuffing his hands behind his back. Lydia barely heard his protests, his angry shouts of denial. She was focused on the girl, on the way her small fingers clutched Lydia's sleeve as if letting go would mean falling into the abyss. "It's okay," Lydia murmured, crouching beside her, brushing a loose curl from her face. "You're safe. Now." The girl stared at her, unblinking. Lydia didn't even know her name. She turned to the officers, her voice shaking. She said he wasn't her dad. One of them, a grizzled man with tired eyes, nodded. "We'll sort it out." But Lydia could see the doubt there. She knew how these things went. Unless there was already a missing persons report, unless they had proof, there was a chance Marcus would walk away from this with nothing but a warning. She wasn't going to let that happen. "Check the registry," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He checked in alone. Ask the clerk. She told me something was off. He didn't let her talk to anyone. Her breath caught. "The receipt." She fumbled into her pocket, pulling out the crumpled slip of paper, her fingers shaking as she handed it over. "Marcus Talbot. This is the name he used at the diner. He left with her an hour ago. She gave me a note. She asked for help." The officer took the paper, glancing over it before giving her a slow nod. "We'll check everything." Lydia exhaled, only then realizing how tightly she'd been holding her breath. The girl still hadn't let go of her. A paramedic knelt beside them, her voice gentle. "Sweetheart, are you hurt?" The child didn't answer. She only pressed herself closer to Lydia. Lydia hesitated, looking down at the girl. "Can I stay with her?" The officer exchanged a glance with the paramedic before nodding. "For now." Lydia didn't know why those words made her throat tighten, why a wave of emotion surged through her like a tide she couldn't hold back. She just nodded, wrapping an arm protectively around the child's small shoulders. As they stepped outside, the night air hit her like a wall. The police lights still flashed, illuminating the worn-down parking lot in rhythmic bursts. A small crowd had gathered, a few motel guests peering through their curtains, others standing near the edge of the lot, murmuring amongst themselves. Marcus was being loaded into the back of a squad car, his face dark with rage. Lydia turned the girl away, shielding her from his glare. "You did good," the paramedic murmured beside her. Lydia swallowed hard. "She did." The girl still hadn't spoken. Not one word. Lydia crouched beside her again, brushing a thumb over the back of her tiny hand. "You're safe now," she whispered. Finally, the child looked at her, her lower lip trembling. Then, in a voice so small Lydia almost didn't hear it, she spoke. "My name is Emma." Lydia's heart clenched. "Hi, Emma," she said softly, squeezing her hand. "I'm Lydia." Emma hesitated before whispering, "I want to go home." Lydia's eyes burned. She nodded. "We're going to find your home, sweetheart. I promise." And for the first time, Emma let out a small, shaky breath. She believed her, but it wasn't over. As the officers spoke in low voices, discussing what to do next, Lydia watched them carefully. There was something tense in their postures, something unsettled. One of the officers walked toward her. "Ma'am, do you know who this child is?" Lydia shook her head. "No, but she knows she doesn't belong with him." She nodded toward the squad car where Marcus sat, his head tilted downward. She was terrified of him. The officer frowned. "The problem is there's no missing child report matching her description." Lydia stiffened. "What?" He sighed. "No recent cases match up. If she was taken, no one has reported her missing yet." Lydia's heart sank. That meant Marcus might not be in as much trouble as he deserved to be. She looked down at Emma. "Do you know your last name, sweetheart?" Emma hesitated, then shook her head. Lydia swallowed. "What about your mom or dad? Do you remember their names?" Emma's brow furrowed. "Mommy," she whispered, "do you know where you live?" Emma's lip trembled. She didn't answer. Lydia turned back to the officer. "So what happens now?" The officer hesitated. "She'll be placed in protective custody until we can figure out where she belongs." Lydia's stomach twisted. She imagined Emma in some unfamiliar place, surrounded by strangers, scared and alone. "Can I go with her?" The officer looked surprised. "That's not how this works." Lydia exhaled sharply, her mind racing. She wasn't family. She wasn't even a legal guardian. She was just a waitress who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But she had to do something. "She trusts me," she said, her voice steady. "Please." The officer studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "You can stay with her tonight, but after that it's up to social services." Lydia let out a breath of relief. She looked down at Emma and offered a small, reassuring smile. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time since she had handed Lydia that note, Emma nodded. She believed her. Lydia sat in the back of the police car with Emma curled up beside her, the little girl's small fingers still gripping. The fabric of Lydia's sleeve, as if letting go, would make her disappear. The air inside the vehicle was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio and the distant hum of the tires against the road. The officer driving had barely spoken since they left the motel, his eyes focused on the dimly lit streets ahead. Emma hadn't said another word. Lydia wanted to tell her everything was going to be okay, that she was safe now, that no one was going to take her away again, but she wasn't sure if that was true. The police didn't even know who Emma belonged to. There were no missing child reports that matched her description, no frantic parents calling in, searching for a lost daughter. That fact gnawed at Lydia, tightening the knot in her stomach. How did a little girl go missing without anyone noticing? She glanced down at Emma, who was staring at the window, her breath fogging up the glass. Her expression was unreadable, but Lydia could feel the tension in her tiny body. She was afraid. Lydia shifted slightly, leaning closer. "Emma, do you remember where you lived before?" Emma hesitated, her small fingers twisting in her lap. Lydia softened her voice. "Anything at all? A street name, a park you like to go to?" Emma's mouth opened slightly, then closed. She shook her head. Lydia exchanged a glance with the officer, but he kept his gaze on the road. He had made it clear earlier that his job was just to transport them. It wasn't his responsibility to unravel this mystery. Lydia sighed. She knew Emma had been through something awful, and she wasn't going to push her. but every second that passed felt like they were losing time. If there were answers to be found, she needed to find them soon. When they pulled up to the station, Lydia felt Emma tense beside her. "It's okay," Lydia whispered. "I'll be with you." The station was quiet this late at night, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The officer led them inside, where another officer, a woman, this time met them with a clipboard and a tired but kind expression. "Is this her?" the woman asked. Lydia nodded. "Her name's Emma." The woman crouched slightly, offering Emma a small smile. "Hey, sweetheart. My name's Officer Reed. I'm just going to ask you a few questions, okay?" Emma's fingers tightened on Lydia's sleeve, Officer Reed noticed. "You can stay with her if that helps." Lydia exhaled, relieved. They led Emma into a small interview room. It wasn't like the harsh, metallic rooms Lydia had seen in movies, just a plain office with a desk, a few chairs and a box of tissues. It was clear they were trying to make it less intimidating, but Emma still looked uneasy. Lydia sat beside her, her presence a silent promise. Officer Reed pulled out a notepad. "Emma, can you tell me how you met that man? Marcus Talbot?" Emma shrank slightly into her seat. He found me." Lydia's heart skipped a beat. "Found you?" Emma nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was alone." Officer Reed's pen hovered over the paper. "Do you remember where?" Emma fidgeted. "A big place, with cars. Lots of cars." "A parking lot?" Lydia asked gently. Emma nodded. Lydia swallowed hard. "Emma, do you remember how you got there?" Emma bit her lip, her eyes flickering toward the table. "I was waiting," she whispered. Lydia's mind raced. "Waiting for who?" "For your mum," she asked softly. Emma's expression crumpled. She nodded. Officer Reed exchanged a glance with Lydia. Lydia's hands curled into fists. Emma hadn't been kidnapped in the way she had imagined. No one had broken into her home or stolen her from a playground. Someone had left her. Lydia forced down the wave of emotion rising in her throat. "Emma," she said gently, "was your mom supposed to come back for you?" Emma hesitated, then whispered, "She said she would." Lydia closed her eyes for half a second, inhaling through her nose. She forced herself to stay steady. "And then Marcus found you?" Emma nodded. Officer Reed wrote something down before looking up. "How long were you waiting before he came?" Emma's small shoulders lifted in a shrug. "A long time. I was hungry." Lydia felt sick. Officer Reed's voice was careful. "And what did he say to you?" Emma shifted. "He said I could come with him, that he would take care of me." Lydia clenched her jaw. It had probably sounded like kindness to a scared little girl. "Did he ever tell you where he was taking you?" Emma shook her head. Lydia exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "Did he ever hurt you?" Emma hesitated for a long time, then whispered, "Not really." That wasn't a no. Officer Reed sighed and set her pen down. "All right, Emma. That's all for now. You did really good, sweetheart." Emma nodded but didn't say anything else. Lydia stood, pressing a comforting hand to Emma's back. "What happens now?" she asked Officer Reed. "We put out an alert, check missing person cases again, now that we have more details. And in the meantime, social services will take over." Lydia's stomach twisted. "She's going into the system." Officer Reed's expression softened. "Just until we find her family." Lydia looked at Emma, at her small, scared face. "She doesn't have anyone," she said quietly. Officer Reed hesitated. "We don't know that yet." Lydia swallowed hard. "Where will she stay tonight?" "A temporary foster home. It's just for a few days while we figure things out." Lydia's heart pounded. Emma didn't need more strangers. She needed stability. She needed to feel safe. "Can she stay with me?" The words were out of her mouth before she even had time to think. Officer Reed blinked. "You're not a registered foster parent." "I don't care. I can take care of her. Just for a night." Officer Reed sighed. "It's not that simple." Lydia looked down at Emma, who was staring at the floor, small and silent. "Please," Lydia whispered. Officer Reed hesitated. Then finally she exhaled. "I'll make a call." Lydia nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't going to let Emma slip through the cracks, not if she could help it. Lydia gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the sound of the radio playing softly in the background. The motel's neon sign flickered in her rearview mirror as she sped down the highway, headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. She had no plan, no real strategy, just an overwhelming certainty that if she didn't act fast, Emma would slip through her fingers. The police had done what they could, but it wasn't enough. Marcus had been arrested, sure, but they still didn't know where Emma belonged, and social services would be coming to take her away soon. Lydia couldn't let that happen. Emma didn't need a system full of strangers. She needed someone who cared. Lydia exhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. If she was going to help Emma, she needed more information. Marcus had claimed he'd found her in a parking lot, but that wasn't enough. She needed to figure out where Emma had come from, who had left her there, and why. Her mind reeled with possibilities. Had she been abandoned? Was someone looking for her? Or was she running from something worse? She picked up her phone and dialed. Come on, she muttered, tapping her fingers against the steering wheel. Finally, a groggy voice answered. Lyd, do you have any idea what time it is? I need your help, she said, cutting straight to the point. Jake sighed on the other end. I figured. You only call me this late when something's on fire. This is serious, Jake. His tone sobered instantly. What's going on? Lydia took a breath, steadying herself. I need you to run a name for me, Marcus Talbot. He checked into a motel in town with a little girl who isn't his daughter. A beat of silence. Jesus. You think I don't know what to think yet, she admitted. But the girl, Emma, she gave me a note asking for help. He's been arrested, but no one knows where she belongs, and I have this awful feeling we're missing something important. Jake exhaled through the phone. All right, give me a sec. Lydia could hear the faint sound of typing in the background as she sped past darkened storefronts and gas stations. She barely registered the familiar sights of her small town. All she could think about was Emma. After what felt like an eternity, Jake spoke again. Okay, Marcus Talbot. He's got a record, but nothing major. A couple of fraud charges, bounced checks, unpaid fines. No history of violence or kidnapping, though. Lydia frowned. That doesn't make sense. Why would he take Emma if he wasn't some kind of trafficker or... She stopped herself, unable to finish the thought. That's the thing, Jake continued. I don't think he took her. Not in the way you're thinking. What do you mean? Jake hesitated. I checked his most recent transactions. That motel was the only place he stayed in town, but before that, he made a payment at a gas station 2 towns over, and before that, he booked a room at another motel off the highway. Lydia's grip on the wheel tightened. He was moving. Her. Yeah, but not like he was running from the law. More like he was trying to keep her hidden. A sick feeling settled in Lydia's stomach. From who? I don't know yet. But listen. There's something else. The parking lot where he supposedly found her. It's near a shopping plaza just outside of town. I cross-referenced missing person reports in that area. Lydia held her breath. And there's nothing recent that matches Emma's description. But he hesitated. There was a case from 8 months ago. A woman named Julia Grayson filed a report for her missing daughter. The age and general description match Emma, but there's no photo attached to the report. It was closed 2 weeks after it was filed. Lydia's stomach dropped. Closed? Why? Jake's voice darkened. It says the mother withdrew the report. Lydia nearly slammed on the brakes. Why would a mother report her child missing and then take it back? That's what I need to find out, Jake said. But if this Julia Grayson is Emma's mom, something isn't right. Lydia's mind raced. Emma had been left in that parking lot, alone and waiting for someone who never came back. Had her mother abandoned her, or had someone forced her to retract the report? Send me the address, she said. Lydia, hold on. If this is bigger than we think, you can't just show up at someone's door and demand answers. Watch me, she said, ending the call. Minutes later, her phone pinged with a message from Jake. An address in the next town over. She changed course, her foot pressing harder on the gas. The neighborhood was nothing like she expected. The houses were large, well-maintained, the kind that came with high mortgages and good school districts. This wasn't the kind of place where people vanished without a trace. She pulled up to the address, her hands shaking slightly as she parked down the street. The house was dark except for a single light in the front window. She took a deep breath and stepped out. As she approached the door, she hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if this wasn't Emma's home? What if she was about to shatter someone's life with nothing but a hunch? But then she thought of Emma's tiny hand gripping hers, the way she had whispered, "I was waiting." Lydia knocked. A long moment passed before the door opened. The woman standing there looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her hair was unkempt, dark circles under her eyes. She blinked at Lydia in confusion. "Julia Grayson?" The woman's breath hitched. Lydia took a steadying breath. "I think I found your daughter." Julia's face went pale. She gripped the edge of the doorframe, her fingers digging into the wood. For a second, Lydia thought she might collapse. Then, in a whisper so quiet she almost didn't hear it, Julia said, "She's alive?" Lydia exhaled. "Yes." Tears welled in Julia's eyes. "Where is she?" Lydia hesitated. "First, I need to know why you stopped looking for her." Julia swallowed hard, looking away. "It wasn't my choice." Lydia's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Julia's eyes flickered with something deep and haunted. "I had to." Lydia stared at her. "Someone made you withdraw the report?" Julia nodded slowly. Lydia's pulse raced. "Who?" Julia looked past her, as if expecting someone to be watching. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "My husband." Lydia felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Emma's father." Julia's voice shook. "He told me if I didn't take back the report, I'd never see her again." Lydia's breath caught. "And now?" Julia's hands trembled. "Now he's coming back for her." Lydia's blood ran cold. Lydia felt her stomach drop, but she didn't let it show. Julia stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. There was something raw in her eyes, something that made Lydia's heart tighten. Fear. Not the kind of fear that came from uncertainty, but the kind that came from knowing exactly what kind of danger you were in. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Julia," she said carefully. "Who is he?" Julia swallowed hard. "My husband, Emma's father." The words felt like ice settling over Lydia's skin. "And you think he's coming back?" Julia gave a small, frantic nod. "He always said he would, that if I ever tried to take her from him, he'd find her. He'd find me. And now, if he knows she's alive—" She cut herself off, gripping the edge of the doorframe as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Lydia exhaled. This was worse than she thought. Emma hadn't just been abandoned. She had been hidden. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lydia said, "I need to know everything." Julia hesitated. Then, with a shuddering breath, she stepped back. "Come inside." The house was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and something faintly floral. Papers were scattered on the coffee table, a laundry basket sat half folded on the couch, and there was an overturned picture frame on the fireplace mantel. It was a house that had once been full of life, but now felt like a place someone had tried to disappear into. Julia ran a hand through her messy hair and sank onto the couch. "He was never a good man," she admitted. "I should have seen it sooner. But when I was pregnant with Emma, I wanted to believe he would change, that he would want to be a father. And for a while he pretended. He made all the promises I wanted to hear." Lydia didn't interrupt. She had heard stories like this before, stories of men who seemed charming until the moment they weren't. Julia let out a hollow laugh. "It started small, controlling little things. Where I went, who I talked to. Then it got worse. I wasn't allowed to work, wasn't allowed to have friends. When Emma was born, he got worse. He didn't want a daughter. He wanted someone to control, just like he controlled me." Lydia's hands clenched. "Did he ever hurt her?" Julia hesitated. Then, in a small, pained voice, she said, "Not in the way you're thinking. He never hit her. He never had to. He controlled her with fear, the way he controlled me." Lydia felt her stomach turn. Julia swallowed. I tried to leave so many times, but every time I packed a bag, every time I thought I could run, he made sure I knew exactly what would happen if I did. Lydia exhaled. How did you get away? Julia's fingers twisted together. One night, he got arrested for a bar fight. Just a stupid, drunken fight, but it gave me enough time. I took Emma, I ran, I thought we were safe. Lydia already knew how this story ended. Julia's eyes filled with guilt. But I wasn't careful enough. He found us. I don't know how, but he did. And when he showed up, I panicked. I told Emma to hide. I thought if I just gave him what he wanted, if I just told him what he needed to hear, he would leave. Lydia felt cold. You told him Emma was gone? Julia nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I told him I lost her, that she wandered away, that I searched but never found her. He didn't believe me at first, but eventually he did. Lydia's heart ached. And that's why you withdrew the report. Julia let out a shaky breath. I thought it was the only way to keep her safe. If I pretended she was gone, he wouldn't look for her. He wouldn't take her. Lydia's chest tightened. She wanted to be angry at Julia. She wanted to tell her that she should have fought harder, that she should have found another way. But the words wouldn't come. She saw the way Julia's hands shook, the way her breath hitched, and she realized Julia had already punished herself more than anyone else ever could. She was waiting for you, Lydia said quietly, in that parking lot. She thought you were coming back. Julia covered her mouth, choking back a sob. Lydia hesitated, then sat beside her. He doesn't know yet. He doesn't know she's alive. We still have time. Julia looked at her, eyes wide. What do I do? Lydia didn't have an easy answer. First, we get Emma back to you. Then, we make sure he never finds her again. Julia wiped her eyes. How? Lydia took a steadying breath. We make sure the police know the truth. We make sure they know what kind of man he is. Julia's voice was barely a whisper. And if that's not enough? Lydia's jaw tightened. Then we don't let him win. Lydia barely made it back to town before dawn. She had promised Julia she would bring Emma back, but first she needed to make sure Marcus Talbot wasn't getting out anytime soon. She drove straight to the police station. Officer Reed was there, sipping coffee and looking like she hadn't slept. When she saw Lydia, she raised an eyebrow. Back so soon? Lydia didn't waste time. I know who Emma belongs to. Reed straightened. Who? Her mother, Julia Grayson. She had to withdraw her missing persons report because Emma's father threatened her. Reed cursed under her breath. You're sure? Lydia nodded. And if you don't keep Marcus locked up, he's going to find her. Reed studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Come with me. They walked down the hall past a row of holding cells. Lydia's pulse quickened when she saw Marcus sitting behind the bars. His eyes flicked up, locking onto hers. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. Lydia's stomach turned. Reed ignored him, pulling a file from a desk. We were already looking deeper into him. Turns out he's got a long history of restraining orders, mostly ex-girlfriends, a few cases that were dropped. Lydia clenched her fists. That's not enough, Reed sighed. But this is. She tapped the file. Julia Grayson's old report is still in the system, and if she's willing to come forward now, we can make sure this sticks, Lydia exhaled in relief. She will, Reed nodded. Then let's get her down here. Lydia turned to leave, but before she could step away, Marcus spoke. You really think you're a hero, don't you? His voice was smooth, mocking. Lydia didn't look at him, but when she reached the door, she paused. She turned just enough to meet his gaze. I think you finally lost, she said, and with that, she walked out. Lydia sat outside the police station, her fingers wrapped tightly around the styrofoam cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The first light of morning was creeping over the horizon, turning the sky into soft shades of lavender and gold, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still, caught in the storm of the last 24 hours, the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. Emma was safe. That was what mattered, but it wasn't over yet. She glanced toward the entrance of the station just as the glass doors swung open. Julia stepped out, looking more fragile than she had the night before. Her face was pale, exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin, but there was something else in her eyes now, something steadier. Lydia stood as Julia approached. "How did it go?" Julia exhaled shakily. "They took my statement. They're reopening the case." Lydia nodded, relief washing over her. "Good. That's good." Julia hesitated. "They said it'll take time before anything is finalized. I still have to go through legal channels to prove my custody over Emma. They want to make sure she's safe." Lydia studied her. "And is she?" Julia flinched, but she met Lydia's gaze. "I'm going to make sure of it." Lydia wanted to believe her. She really did. Before she could say anything else, the doors opened again. Emma stepped outside, her tiny frame wrapped in an oversized coat someone had given her inside. Her small hands gripped the fabric tightly, her eyes scanning the street as if she wasn't sure where she belonged. Julia inhaled sharply. "Emma." The little girl froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Julia took a tentative step forward. "Sweetheart, it's me." Emma's fingers clenched around the coat. She stared at Julia, her expression unreadable. Lydia's heart ached. Emma had waited for her mother for so long, had spent endless days and nights alone hoping she would come back. And now here she was, just a few steps away. But it wasn't that simple. Julia took another step. "I never stopped looking for you." Emma swallowed. "You left me." The words were small, but they hit like a hammer. Julia's breath hitched. "No, sweetheart. I didn't. I thought I was keeping you safe. I thought if he believed you were gone, he wouldn't hurt you." Emma's lip trembled. "I waited." "I know." Julia's voice broke. "And I'm so sorry." Emma didn't move. Lydia crouched beside her. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "You don't have to rush, but your mom loves you. She's been scared just like you were. She made mistakes, but she's here now." Emma hesitated, then slowly turned to Lydia. "Will you come too?" Lydia's throat tightened. She hadn't thought about what came next. She had spent all this time trying to keep Emma safe, but she wasn't her family. She wasn't her mother. Still, the thought of walking away, of leaving Emma to figure this out on her own, made her chest ache. She swallowed hard. "I'll be here. I promise." Emma turned back to Julia, her expression uncertain. But then, cautiously, she took a small step forward, then another. Julia's breath caught as Emma finally closed the distance between them. She crouched, arms open but not touching, waiting, and then Emma finally moved into her mother's arms. Julia let out a soft, broken sob as she hugged her daughter. For the first time in almost a year, Lydia looked away, giving them a moment, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. After a long moment, Julia pulled back, brushing a stray curl from Emma's face. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. Emma didn't respond, but she didn't pull away. Lydia exhaled, finally allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this would turn out okay. The sound of a car pulling up drew her attention. A woman stepped out. Someone from Child Protective Services, most likely. Lydia knew this part wasn't over yet. There would be home visits, court hearings, all the red tape that came with situations like this. But Emma wasn't alone anymore. Lydia turned as Julia stood, still holding Emma's hand. Julia met her gaze. "Thank you," Lydia nodded. "Take care of her." "I will." Emma hesitated, then turned to Lydia. "You're not leaving, right?" Lydia knelt so they were eye level. "Never," she promised. Emma chewed her lip, then slowly uncurled her fingers from Julia's grip and wrapped her small arms around Lydia's neck. Lydia hugged her back, swallowing the lump in her throat. When Emma pulled away, she stepped back to Julia's side. The social worker approached, speaking quietly to them, but Lydia stayed where she was, watching as they moved toward the car. Julia helped Emma into the back seat, fastening her seatbelt before sliding in beside her. As the car pulled away, Emma pressed a small hand against the window. Lydia lifted her own in return, and then they were gone. She stood there for a long moment, the quiet settling over her. She had done what she needed to do. Emma was safe. Julia was getting a second chance. But for the first time since that night at the diner, Lydia felt lost, The adrenaline that had kept her moving for the past 24 hours was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and something else, something emptier. She had saved Emma, but now what? A familiar voice broke through her thoughts. "You okay?" She turned to see Officer Reed standing in the doorway, coffee cup in hand. Lydia let out a breath. "Yeah," Reed studied her. "You did good." Lydia gave a small, tired smile. "Thanks." Reed nodded toward the parking lot. "You should go home, get some sleep." Lydia glanced at her car but didn't move. Yeah, but she knew sleep wouldn't come easy, because now that it was over, she didn't know what to do with herself. She had spent so much time fighting for Emma, following her instincts, refusing to let the girl disappear. And now, for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to fight. She exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. Maybe that was okay. Maybe just this once she could let herself rest. With one last glance at the empty street, Lydia turned and walked toward her car. Tomorrow would come, and when it did, she'd figure out where to go next. For now, though, she just needed to breathe. Lydia sat at her kitchen table, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of her. It had gone cold a while ago, but she couldn't bring herself to pour another. The quiet of her apartment felt heavier than usual, pressing against her like a weight she couldn't shake. She had spent so much time in motion, chasing down leads, following gut instincts, fighting to keep Emma safe. And now there was nothing left to do. The past few days had been a blur of paperwork, meetings, and endless waiting. Julia was still working through the legal process, proving her custody, proving she could keep Emma safe. There were check-ins, home visits, court dates ahead. But for now, Emma was with her mother, starting a life that had almost been stolen from her. It was what Lydia had fought for, what she had wanted. So why did she feel so empty? Her phone vibrated against the table, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen, a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it. But something told her to pick up. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a familiar small voice. "Lydia." Lydia's breath caught. "Emma?" A quiet rustle on the other end. "Hi." Lydia smiled, some of the weight lifting from her chest. "Hi, sweetheart, how are you?" Emma hesitated. "Okay." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Lydia leaned back in her chair. "Are you with your mum?" "Yeah." Lydia could hear faint background noise, a television playing softly, the murmur of Julia's voice somewhere nearby. Emma's voice dropped slightly. "I wanted to talk to you." Lydia swallowed. "I'm glad you called." Another pause. Then Emma said, "I miss you." Lydia's heart clenched. She pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose, forcing herself to stay steady. "I miss you too." Emma shifted on the other end of the line. "Are you okay?" Lydia let out a small, breathy laugh. "I should be asking you that." "I know." Lydia closed her eyes for a moment. "I'm okay, Emma. I promise." Emma was quiet. Then in a small voice she said, "I still have the napkin." Lydia's breath caught. "You do?" "Yeah. The one I gave you. I kept it." Lydia didn't know why that hit her so hard, but it did. I wanted to say thank you." Lydia blinked back, the sudden burn in her eyes. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart." Emma's voice was firm. "I do." Lydia let out a shaky breath. "Well, you're welcome." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emma said, "Will I see you again?" Lydia hesitated. She didn't know what the rules were, what social services would allow, how much she was still supposed to be involved, but she knew what she wanted. "Yeah," she said softly. "You will." Emma let out a small breath, like she had been holding it in. "Okay. Okay." A voice in the background, Julia calling Emma's name. "I have to go," Emma said. Lydia smiled. "Go on then. Be good." Emma hesitated. "Bye, Lydia." Lydia's throat tightened. "Bye, Emma." The call ended. Lydia sat there for a long moment, staring at her phone. Then, slowly, she let out a breath. The weight that had been pressing on her for days wasn't gone. Not entirely, but it was lighter. She didn't know what came next, but she knew she wasn't alone. Sometimes the smallest actions can change a life. Lydia could have ignored the note, but she didn't. She listened to her instincts, and because of that, Emma found her way home. This story is a reminder that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. If something feels wrong, trust your gut. Speak up. You never know who might be waiting for someone to help them. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps us out, and let us know in the comments what you thought about this story. See you in the next one.